Hi everybody, it's Sue and Sal again, and we're here for week 5 of our Victory Gardens weekly tutorials. And this week we are going to be talking about getting the ground ready and actually getting our plants in. And so we'll give you a close-up look at the garden, but we already have a pretty good crop of weeds growing, so we'll talk a little bit about that, and we're going to talk about getting the garden laid out. And then we'll probably film this over a couple of days so that I can actually get the garden worked up, and then we'll be popping our seedlings in. So here we are, we're going to lay out our beds. I'm just going to give you some tips on doing that. So basically, I've got my pathway for my buffer here already laid out. And then I'm just going to put my tape measure down. So we're going to be going with 4-foot beds and 2-foot pathways. Once I have my tape measure down so that I can see the numbers, I'm just going to go through and mark off where I'm at. So here's my buffer pathway. I'm going to go to 4 feet and then 6 feet. So this is my 2-foot pathway. And then 6 and 4 is 10. So this is a 4-foot bed. Another 2-foot pathway, and then we've got another 4 feet and another 2-foot pathway. So you can just use your tape measure like this to get yourself all squared away. And then I'll just go to the other end of the garden and lay it down as well and make my marks. And that way I'm going to get my my beds and pathways all laid out. So we will be doing that before we plant. And as I said earlier, we do already have some weeds growing, which you might already too. So we're going to just take a quick look at that as well, and what you might want to do to get ready before you plant.
So now we are in our garden with our nice crop of weeds, and we're just going to talk about a little of the common weeds that you might find in your own garden so that you can be a little familiar with them and also know which ones you're going to see all summer long and just kind of have to contend with. So our first weed that we've got here is quackgrass. And this weed is really annoying because it's a perennial weed, so it lives for a long time, it sends its roots under the soil, and it just kind of gets everywhere. So there's a couple different kinds of grass that you're going to see or that you could see in your garden. And this is one of them. You'll know that it's quackgrass if it has long roots that are hard to weed. Otherwise, if it's got really shallow roots, then it might be an annual grass, and we can see if we can find some of those. Over here we've got some creeping Charlie. If you have a nice shady spot in your garden, you might have some good creeping Charlie growing. It has a lot of roots that grow on top of the soil surface and don't really send down any deep roots, so it's pretty easy to weed, but it will get really thick and invasive if left untended. Over here we've got some plantain, and plantain is actually a really cool medicinal herb, but it's not very cool when it's growing in your garden beds. So this one has some broad leaves. If you start looking in any unsprayed lawn, you'll probably see a lot of this growing. It has a deep taproot, so it can be a little bit of a challenge to weed, but if you have a tool that can get down pretty deep, you should be able to just pop it out. Over here, we've got one of my personal nemesises out in the farm. So this one is some variety of dock, and this has a super deep taproot. It gets really big if you don't weed it right away. The leaves get huge, and it's just really tough once it gets established. So we're lucky here because it's not too big yet, so we're just going to try to get the whole taproot out so it doesn't re-sprout. So these are just a few of the weeds that we found in our Victory Garden area. You may have some different weeds, and we will keep talking about these as they spring up here as we take care of them. So Sue is going to demonstrate how she's going to get this all cleaned up so we're ready to plant.
So I'm just going to start here with breaking the soil out of the pathways and into the beds and getting the beds smoothed out. So that's what I'm doing here. Once the beds are laid out with the rake, then we'll go back through. I'm going back through with the stirrup hoe, just to get out any of the weeds that are still there after shaping with the rake, and then the beds will be ready for planting. And obviously, this video is sped up. As you can see, my back is pretty straight while I'm doing this. As I was discussing earlier, the stirrup hoe is a good tool that way, that you can stand up pretty straight while you're using it, so it's much easier on your back.
Hey everybody, it's day 2. So all the beds have been shaped out and our pathways are looking good, and we were planning on getting ready to plant. And then we got almost 2 inches of rain last night, and we're going to show you a little bit of why that is not the ideal conditions for you to plant into.
So here's a close-up of after I went walking in the garden. You can see there's some pretty good footprints in there. So this is when you do not want to be walking around in your garden. When it's this wet, you cause a lot of soil damage, a lot of compaction of the soil.
But never fear, we are still going to be planting. It's just going to maybe be in a day or two, and we want to make sure that you are ready to plant as soon as your soil has dried out a little bit. So we're going to do a demonstration on how to transplant and just talk through what you're going to want to do as soon as your soil is a little bit softer and drier and more workable. Alright, so we are going to transplant some tomato plants. And as we mentioned before, it might be helpful if you want to have a straight line to put some stakes and tie a string between them, and then you can kind of make sure your plants are going to be growing in a nice straight line. And so since this is just a demonstration, I'll start over here. And if you remember back a couple weeks ago, we had talked about different spacings and different layouts for your garden. So feel free to refer to that video, or we can just talk about your bigger plants. You want to be a little bit further spaced apart, and your shorter plants can be a little closer together. So tomatoes, your squashes, they're going to be a bigger plant. You're going to want probably 1 foot to 2 foot spacing between them. So for me, I really like to use my hori-hori, or my trowel tool, because it is almost exactly 1 foot long. So I just use that to figure out my spacings for my plants, and I'm just going to lay that down right along the line, and I'm going to start my first planting about 1 foot away from the edge of the stake. So when I'm transplanting, I'm just going to dig a hole here, and when you do this, you don't want the soil to be as wet as it is here. This is a little bit hard to work with. You're just going to dig a hole that's a little bit larger than the size of the plant that you're planting in it. And then to get them out, I'm just going to kind of hold the base of the plant between my fingers so that it doesn't come tumbling out, and just kind of loosen the root ball here until I feel it kind of falling out, and then I can just pull it out a little bit with the other hand, and should come out looking somewhat like this. And then depending on just how big your plants have been growing in their container, their roots might be a little bit root bound or a little bit just close together. So I always like to just kind of soften them up, just kind of loosen them up so that the roots are able to start growing outwards once you get them in the ground, rather than just kind of growing around each other. So now I've loosened the roots up, and I'm just going to put my tomato into this hole I've dug. I'm going to push my soil in around it, and then that's pretty much it. And now we're going to just water it in. I mean, we would normally water it in. You won't want to be planting when it's this wet, but essentially, you know, this is how we're going to transplant any of our plants. And then if I'm moving on to planting the next tomato in the row, I'm just going to take my tool to measure it out. And so I'd probably go with a good maybe 18-inch spacing. So I'm going to go right there, and then dig another hole and repeat the process until I've planted my row.
One of the other things that you have to transplant is some of your squash, and they came in these little peat pots. In theory, you can just put the whole pot in the ground and bury it, but what I've found is that sometimes the roots don't really want to come through the peat pot, and it can also take some moisture away from the plant. So I usually like to either take an X-Acto knife and make some slits in it, or rip it a bit, crunch it up a little bit, just so that there's some breaks in this pot before I put it in the ground. The other thing is that there's several plants in this peat pot, and you could just put them all in the ground together. You also could, if you are gentle, you could kind of take the peat pot away and then gently split them apart and separate them out a little bit and give them a little more space, especially the zucchini. I think I'd recommend doing that with the zucchini in particular. But with even the cucumbers and the winter squash, you could even just split it into 2 and 2 instead of leaving all 4 of them together.
All right, and one of the final kind of tricky plants that we can talk about is your herbs. So most everything else, there's just one plant, maybe 2 per cells, and they should be pretty easy to split up and put them in the appropriate spacing. You may notice with your herbs that there are a couple plants planted per cell. And now, if you want, you can absolutely just plant the cell, plant them all together. And they're herbs, so they're not super heavy feeders. They should do okay just being planted in a little patch like that. Otherwise, you can separate them out if you want to. And though they will look a little bit sad at first, they should be completely fine. So we're gonna do that the same way we did the tomatoes, where we just kind of hold a few of the herbs between my fingers so they don't fall out. Gonna invert this container and just squeeze it to gently loosen them. And one other tip is that you will want to make sure that you have watered your containers, that they're nice and the soil's really nice and moist before you try to get them out of the containers. Because if your plants are a little bit dry and the soil's dry, it's going to be really hard and just kind of break away. So we made sure that these were nice and well watered before we went ahead and started transplanting them. And now these ones you're going to want to be gentle because some of the roots seem like they've started to grow into the other cells. So if you have a really difficult time, it might be a good idea to just get a scissors and just cut along this so that you can free your plants without damaging them. And now here you can see a couple of them are trying to get out all at the same time. They've grown together a little bit, but I'm just gonna kind of gently work them back and forth so most of the roots separate. Get the leaves separated too. And here's our collection we've got parsley here. And now with this, it's more just kind of squeezing them and just working them apart a little bit. And you're gonna end up, some are gonna have a nice root chunk, like this guy. And some of them might be a little bit smaller. This one is just gonna have a few roots. And it doesn't look like a whole lot, but if you plant it and keep it, watered, it is going to adjust and start growing. So we can do this and just separate out all of our plants if we want to, or just kind of plant maybe a couple of them together and they'll do just fine. All right, so now that we've looked at our in-bed gardens that are very nice and saturated, and it has begun raining again a little bit, just to really drive home that point, we're gonna look at the raised beds here and just show how the soil is gonna be a little bit different. Your raised bed, especially if you have a little potting soil or a little bit of your own mixture of compost and topsoil, and just it being off of the ground, it's going to be a little bit more well drained, so it might not be so terribly saturated in rainstorms. And now if we look into the soil, you can see that this has a little bit more of potting mix worked in with the compost, so it's a little bit softer. It's not like clumping together. It's just a little bit sandier. And now this is it's probably still a little bit wet, but I would say honestly you could plant into it when it looks like this. It's just not all clumped together like the in-ground soil. So raised beds can be a little bit more convenient for those reasons.
This is the soil in the garden, and as you can see, it's sticking together much more than the soil in the raised bed, and it's pretty clumpy. So you definitely don't want to be walking in this or planting in this if you can help it. One other thing that we wanted to mention about the transplanting is it's always a good idea to take a look at your long-range forecast and just make sure that the nighttime temperatures are going to be kind of settled and not dipping too low. Most of your plants will be good down into the mid-30s, but I usually don't want to transplant if they're looking at low 40s, just because with variations locally you can get quite a bit cooler than your weather forecast is saying. So I would say if you're seeing anything dipping into the low 40s, you might want to hold off on your transplanting until that's passed. And just a reminder, Memorial Day was really early this year, so it's still only May, and there's still plenty of time to get in your gardens. So anything else this week, Sal?
Hopefully you're able to get out in the next couple of days once it's nice and warm, and get your garden planted, and then we look forward to meeting back up with you next week with our gardens all planted and ready to just talk about maintaining and getting those plants thriving. So
yeah, great. And I think next week we'll probably also talk a bit about what to do with your pathways and also some trellising. So yeah, and then don't forget to put any questions you have in the comments, and we'll try and get you answers. Thanks, everybody.
See you next week.